The police sirens pierced the quiet night, their wailing drawing closer to Darius's house. His heart raced as he realized his simple act of kindness had somehow spiraled into a nightmare that threatened to destroy everything he'd worked for. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed through the quiet suburban street, shattering the peaceful evening. Darius Carter, a lanky 17-year-old with close-cropped hair and warm brown eyes, stared in disbelief at the cold steel encircling his wrists. Just yesterday, he had been helping Mrs. Hastings with her groceries, and now he was being treated like a criminal. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer droned, his voice a monotone that barely registered in Darius's stunned mind. The young man's gaze darted frantically between the two police officers flanking him and his mother, Nadine, who stood on their small front porch, her hand pressed against her mouth in horror. "There must be some mistake," Nadine said, her voice trembling. "My son wouldn't steal anything. He's a good boy." Officer Ryan Bradley, the younger of the two cops, avoided eye contact with both Darius and his mother. His partner, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Nolan, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're just following up on a report. Your son will have a chance to explain himself down at the station." As they led Darius to the waiting patrol car, he could feel the eyes of his neighbors boring into him. Some watched from behind twitching curtains, while others stood openly on their lawns, whispering to each other. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, heavier than the handcuffs binding his wrists. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong," Darius called out, his voice cracking. "I swear!" Nadine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, baby. We'll sort this out. I'm right behind you." As the car door slammed shut, Darius caught a glimpse of Charles Anderson, their next-door neighbor, standing on his porch with a self-satisfied smirk. The old man's eyes gleamed with a mixture of triumph and disdain that made Darius's stomach churn. The ride to the police station was a blur of sirens and streetlights. Darius's mind raced, replaying the events of the previous day. He had been walking home from basketball practice when he spotted Mrs. Hastings struggling with her groceries. The elderly woman lived alone, and Darius often saw her shuffling down the street, leaning heavily on her cane. "Let me help you with those, Mrs. Hastings," he had said, jogging up to her with a smile. Mrs. Hastings had beamed at him, her wrinkled face lighting up. "Oh, Darius, you're such a dear, thank you." He had carried her bags into her house, making small talk about school and his upcoming college applications. Mrs. Hastings had insisted on giving him a few dollars for his trouble, but Darius had politely refused. "It's no trouble at all, ma'am. Have a great day." Now, less than 24 hours later, he was being accused of robbery. The injustice of it all made his head spin. At the police station, Darius was fingerprinted and photographed, the flash of the camera searing his retinas. He was then led to a small windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the air smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Officer Bradley entered the room, his youthful face a mask of professionalism. He sat across from Darius, a file folder in his hands. "All right, Darius, why don't you tell me what happened yesterday afternoon?" Darius took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just helping Mrs. Hastings with her groceries, sir. That's all. I would never steal from her or anyone else." Bradley's eyes flickered with something akin to sympathy before he schooled his features back into neutrality. "Mr. Anderson claims he saw you leaving Mrs. Hastings's house with something tucked under your shirt. Can you explain that?" Darius's brow furrowed in confusion. "What? No, that's not true. I didn't take anything. You can ask Mrs. Hastings herself." "We will," Bradley assured him, "but right now I need you to be honest with me. If you made a mistake, it's better to come clean now." The implication that he was lying made Darius's blood boil. "I am being honest," he said, his voice rising. "I'm telling you exactly what happened. Why don't you believe me?" Before Bradley could respond, the door opened, and Sergeant Nolan entered, followed by a harried-looking Nadine. "Oh, Darius," she breathed, rushing to embrace her son. Nolan cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter, please have a seat. We need to discuss the situation." As Nadine sat down, her hand gripping Darius's tightly, Nolan continued. "Your son is being accused of theft. We have a witness who claims to have seen him leaving the victim's house with stolen property." "That's impossible," Nadine insisted. I raised my son better than that. Who's this witness? I'm afraid we can't disclose that information at this time, Nolan said, his tone clipped. Darius couldn't hold back any longer. It was Mr. Anderson, wasn't it? Mom, you know he's always had it out for us. Ever since we moved in, he's been looking for any excuse to cause trouble. Nadine's eyes widened in realization. Is this true? Are you basing these accusations on Charles Anderson's word? Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Nolan remained impassive. We have to follow up on all reports, Mrs. Carter. Now, if Darius wants to confess and return the stolen property, we might be able to work out a deal. A deal? Darius exclaimed, incredulous. I didn't steal anything. There's nothing to confess. The interrogation continued for what felt like hours. Darius repeated his story over and over, his frustration growing with each retelling. Nadine alternated between fierce defense of her son and pleading with the officers to see reason. Finally, Bradley stood up. We'll need to speak with Mrs. Hastings and gather more evidence. In the meantime, Darius, you're free to go, but don't leave town. We'll be in touch. As they left the police station, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Darius should have been at his college interview, discussing his dreams of becoming an engineer. Instead, he was walking out of a police station, his future suddenly uncertain. Nadine, her arm around her son's shoulders, said, It's going to be okay, baby. We'll figure this out. Darius nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The world he thought he knew, a world where hard work and kindness were rewarded, suddenly seemed like a naive fantasy. As they drove home, Darius stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of his neighborhood roll by. He thought about his father, who had died when Darius was just a boy. How would he have handled this situation? Would he have known how to navigate a system that seemed stacked against them from the start? When they pulled into their driveway, Darius noticed Charles Anderson watching from his porch again. The old man's eyes were cold, his thin lips curved in a smug smile. Darius felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd experienced before. Why does he hate us so much, Mom? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nadine sighed, following her son's gaze. Some people's hearts are poisoned by fear and ignorance, Darius. They can't see past the color of our skin to the content of our character. As they walked into their house, Darius's phone buzzed with notifications. News traveled fast in their tight-knit community, and his social media was already blowing up with messages from friends and classmates. Is it true? I heard you got arrested. What happened, man? Darius turned off his phone, unable to deal with the barrage of questions and assumptions. He trudged up to his room, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day's events. His bedroom was a testament to his achievements and aspirations. Trophies from basketball tournaments lined his shelves alongside academic awards, and a well-worn copy of The Autobiography of Malcolm X sat on his desk next to a stack of college brochures. He flopped onto his bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars he'd stuck on his ceiling as a child. They seemed to mock him now, their dim light a pale imitation of the bright future he'd imagined for himself. A soft knock on his door roused him from his thoughts. Darius, Nadine called. Can I come in? Yeah, Mom, he replied, sitting up. Nadine entered, carrying a mug of hot chocolate, her go-to comfort drink for difficult times. She sat on the edge of Darius's bed, handing him the steaming cup. I called Mrs. Hastings, she said. She was shocked when I told her what happened. She said she'll go to the police station first thing in the morning to set things straight. Darius nodded, a small spark of hope flickering in his chest. Thanks, Mom. I can't believe this is happening. I've always tried to do the right thing, you know? And now it's like none of that matters. Nadine reached out, cupping her son's face in her hands. Listen to me, Darius. What you've done, your hard work, your kindness, your integrity, it matters. It matters more than ever. This situation is unfair and unjust, but we're going to fight it together. As Darius looked into his mother's eyes, he saw a fierce determination that matched the fire building in his own heart. He nodded, squaring his shoulders. You're right, Mom. We'll fight this. But what if it's not enough? What if the system is so broken that the truth doesn't matter? Nadine was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. Then we change the system, she said finally, but we do it the right way, with dignity, with perseverance, and with the truth on our side. As the night deepened around them, Darius and Nadine sat together, sipping hot chocolate and strategizing. They would call a lawyer in the morning, gather character witnesses, and prove Darius's innocence, no matter what it took. But even as they planned, a seed of doubt had been planted in Darius's mind. If the system could be turned against him so easily, was playing by its rules really the best way forward? Or was there another path, a path of resistance, of taking justice into his own hands? As he finally drifted off to sleep, these questions swirled in Darius's mind, setting the stage for the challenging days to come.